This is FRM Part 2, Book 3, Operational Risk and Resiliency, and the chapter on guidance on managing outsourcing risk. This should be one of your favorite chapters inside of this book, mostly because it's not really even a chapter. You'll notice the footnote tells us that this is a letter from the Fed Board of Governors to financial institutions. And what I like about this letter is that it's relatively short. I'm guessing you guys like that as well. Only a handful of learning objectives, but what really makes this interesting for me is that first paragraph is the statement of purpose, which I love. And this statement of purpose really outlines what we're going to talk about over the next few minutes. The purpose of this letter is to offer guidance to financial institutions on outsourcing operational activities. And it lists a bunch of these things like accounting and appraisal management and human resources and internal audit and loan provision, in addition to the traditional core bank processing and information technology services. But I think this letter could have sounded something like this. It could have said, "Dear financial institutions, make sure that you listen to everything that your dentist says to you during the course of your life. Here, indulge me for just a moment. You know, ever since you were a little kid, right, the dentist tells you to brush your teeth every day, a couple times a day, floss, don't drink soda. If you have candy, brush your teeth right afterwards. Make sure you gargle, fluoride, all that kind of good stuff." And this is pretty much common sense from the dentist's standpoint, but what? We don't floss enough, right? We don't brush our teeth enough. We eat too much chocolate. We eat too much candy. It's like that old Stephen Wright thing. Did you ever hear the comedian Stephen Wright say he likes to eat a box of Oreo cookies right before he goes into the dentist? Well, we don't want to do that. We don't want to eat a box of Oreo cookies before we go to the dentist. We want to do all these things as a financial institution so that we can minimize this operational risk and become more efficient and become more effective. You'll see what I mean here in these learning objectives. All right, explain how risks can arise through outsourcing activities. So we'll talk about that through a couple of slides, and then we'll look at effective program to manage outsourcing risk. So this falls into this heading of operational risk. We need to add that to all of the risks that we've talked about throughout all of these slide decks. We have a couple of slides on due diligence, and due diligence is kind of a fancy term for pay attention to everything that your parents or your grandparents or your teachers or your professors have told you, right? Just do some research. And then we'll look at some topics and provisions at the end. So let's go ahead and start with this obvious notion and a definition of what is outsourcing practice, where a financial institution hires a third party to perform services. My wife has recently outsourced emptying the dishwasher, emptying the dryer, and watering her annuals outside to my 3 boys. And of course, it's easy to outsource when the labor is right inside of your house. You can tell them what to do and you can watch over it. But of course, my wife didn't do any of these things that we're going to talk about during the next slide deck. And we need to make sure, as good financial risk managers, that we brush our teeth. I did mention some commonly outsourced activities in my introduction. That was from the purpose. Here are a couple other ones as well. Right after that statement of purpose, there's a discussion on why are we going to outsource. And really, this comes down to what we learned back in our microeconomics days, right? Marginal cost, marginal benefit. I'm still one of the final dudes in my neighborhood to cut my own grass. I could easily outsource this and pay $40 or $50 a week to have some people come and cut my grass. But I like to cut my grass because it gets me outside, it gives me some exercise, and it lets me clear my head, and I can think about what I'm doing with my life and all those kinds of things. So marginal cost, marginal benefit. So notice the top one, cost savings. Now, for me, expert service, cutting the glass is really not that high level of a skill set. However, inside of a financial institution, we may not have any experts on appraisal management or providing appraisal services. And so it's probably better for us to outsource that. Scalability, of course, if we're only appraising one property, then I could probably learn enough to go out and give us some kind of a reasonable appraisal. But my gosh, if we're appraising hundreds of properties every week, I don't have time to drive to all of these properties. And then I like the one on the left there, focus on core business. This is what we learned 1958 from Professors Modigliani and Miller, who kind of gave us an idea of what the value of a publicly held corporation, and any business is for that matter. Focus on the core business, concentrate on generating lots of cash flows so that the net present value turns out to be positive, or the internal rate of return, or even the modified internal rate of return turns out to be high. So this is a really good exam question, couched inside of this little diagram. But this one here relates directly to the first learning objective. So notice in the middle we have these outsourcing risks, and then we list 6 of them, going around in the circle. Put them in a circle so that we're not overemphasizing or underemphasizing either one of these. Each one of these is extremely important, and if the financial institution is not aware and not cognizant and doesn't pay attention to the risk-reward trade-off for each one of these risks, then clearly that's going to be a fault inside of the culture and inside of upper management. And so I would probably go ahead and memorize these risks. These are probably self-evident, so compliance risks, of course, and legal risks. Those are kind of tied together a little bit. Reputational risks, we'll talk about a couple of examples, but clearly there are reputations that have been slammed over the years because of a simple process that could have easily been avoided. We've probably focused a lot on operational risk there on the bottom left. Losses due to inadequate internal processes. We've talked about that before, but we haven't probably spent enough time on country risk down at the bottom. And so not only do we need to look at things like, exchange rates and inflation rates and interest rates and all of the economic conditions inside of that country, we need to be aware of the social and cultural differences between and among the different countries. And then, of course, lastly, we can't forget political risks. And political risks throughout the world seem to be rising as governments become more and more influential, not only in the daily lives of individuals, but inside of the financial institutions industry as well. Of course, COVID-19 is one of those great examples where governments can come in and say, okay, this is the way we're going to live, and then we have to make those adjustments. 2 quick examples that is discussed inside of this letter. Raphael's Bank, yes, outsourcing failures that rendered customer accounts inaccessible over just an 8-hour period. All right, so think about this. Lots of us don't use our credit cards every minute of every day, but when we want to use it, of course, we want that to be available. So 3,367 customers were unable to use their cards. And so this is a real hit to not only cash flow, but specifically to reputation, as we talked about in the previous slide. And then the RBS had this outsourcing of their system software. And this is where you get into tremendous amounts of risk in terms of the possibility that the financial institution is unaware of those IT processes that are specifically used by the outsourced. All right, here's a good learning objective. Let's discuss the elements of an effective program to manage outsourcing risk. Now, let me just remind you, we've talked about, managing market risk, managing credit risk, managing third-party risk, and the commonality between and among all of those risk management programs is to identify the risks, quantify the risks, and then manage the risk. I mean, that of course is the third word here. So note we'll go from A to F, and let's just spend just a brief moment on each of these elements. Once again, these are probably self-evident and consistent with what we've talked about before. All right, so risk assessment, performing the activity in-house or having it performed by a third party. There's marginal cost, marginal benefit analysis. And then once we determine that the third party is appropriate, then we need to pick up the phone and call several people, right? When we had a problem in our house recently with our air conditioner, we picked up the phone and we called 3 different air conditioner replacement men and women and said, okay, what are you going to do and how are you going to do it and how fast are you going to get here? And of course, the how fast are you going to get here, that took precedence over any other kind of an answer since it was 100 degrees when we made that call. But of course, you need qualified and experienced service providers. And, I'm guaranteeing that all you really need to do is pick up the phone and talk to your boss, or pick up the phone and call your competition down the street and say, hey, who do you guys use for this particular service? There's due diligence. What did I say just a little bit ago? Due diligence, that's a fancy term for just pay attention and do your research, right? Perform an objective evaluation. So the concern here is that there's some kind of a business relationship or perhaps a personal relationship, between the institution and that third party. So that's why we have perform an objective evaluation in bolded, so that if it's your brother-in-law who is a specialist in human resources and maybe recruiting a specific type of a financial risk manager, you want to make certain that you're not hiring your brother-in-law just because he takes you golfing, every third Sunday. And then, of course, once you decide on a third party to outsource, then you have to sign a contract, right? So you need to make certain that the contract is written properly, and that's why we have lawyers and in-house counsel to make certain that the contract is appropriate and enforceable and all that kind of stuff. How about incentive compensation review, right? Let's go back to my marginal cost, marginal benefit analysis. If we're going to outsource and we believe we're going to save, let's say, $10 a customer, and whatever that is, we might put inside of the contract, say, hey, look, we're expecting to save $10 per customer. If we save $12 per customer, you can share in that 10 to 12. And of course, this needs to be written out in explicit and legal details. Of course, we want to monitor. We don't want to just say something like, okay, you're hired, we'll see you in 3 months. So we want to make certain that we have some performance metrics, some kind of a return on investment, whatever that is. I mean, you can put some income in the numerator and some kind of an investment in the denominator, and there are different ways to arrange these kinds of metrics so that you know exactly what you're dealing with. I mean, if you're outsourcing some type of an accounting, like an accounts payable, you might have a different metric than if you were outsourcing sales or derivative trading or something like that. And then business continuity and contingency considerations. Boy, I love this. Back when I was in graduate school, I learned the value of an embedded option in some type of a security. And I go to great lengths to teach my students about embedded options. And so this is really not an embedded option here, but it has some elements of an embedded option, right? What we need to make certain is that if our sump pump breaks, if our air conditioner breaks, if my son fails to unload the dishwasher on a regular basis, what are we going to do about it? Now, this slide should be pretty self-evident. How should we perform due diligence? What did I say earlier? Just put your gloves on, roll up your sleeves, get out the shovel, and dig and dig and dig. I don't mean physically, but I just mean, all right, so what are these questions here? What's the status in the industry? What's their corporate history? How about a background check? Vetting, vetting, that's a great term for politicians, but clearly what we want to do is we want to make certain that the person that we're hiring is going to A, show up for work, and then B, do a job that is consistent with what we require of our own employees as established by senior executives and the board of directors. Now, of course, we can do this by looking at the third party's financial statements. We can look at all different sorts of things like length of time, staff resources, and insurance status. We tried to hire a guy to come and paint our shutters up on our second floor, and I asked the dude to provide evidence of insurance, and he said, "Well, I don't really need it. I'm pretty careful," and so we didn't hire that dude. Look at that first block point. Responsibility of the financial institution to ensure that the services provided comply with applicable laws, safe and sound banking practices. All right, so privacy protection, retention of records, contingency planning. Of course, you don't want to hire someone to come in and do an internal audit and then post on their Facebook page, "Hey, did you know that Jim works over there at John's Bank and Jim makes $7 million a year. What does he do for $7 million a year?" How about this learning objective, the elements of well-defined contracts? And remember, there's a long history, hundreds of years, maybe even multiple centuries, where the contract law and the efficacy of contracts has been debated and advanced. So of course, in this day and age, we ought to be able to know what a well-defined contract looks like. All right, so scope means that we're going to say, okay, this means that you're going to do this and this and this and this, and you're not going to do anything like that. Of course, my son's reaction is, okay, I emptied the dishwasher, but that's it. I'm not doing anything else. Cost and compensation, of course, this has to be spelled out explicitly. Right to audit, absolutely. We want to make certain that if on any day we can say to the third party, "Hey, we're coming over, or you come in, we want to see these kinds of variables and these kinds of ratios." And so that gets us to the next one there, monitoring of performance standards. There should be ownership and license, of course. That third party obviously could do the work somewhere else, but they could come on site, onto our site. So we need to make certain that if they're on our site, that they follow proper procedures that all of our employees are exposed to, of course. Do we want to be able to sue somebody if they fail us? Of course. And then how do we get terminated? Dispute resolutions and insurance, and then customer complaint, right? If we're complaining about, maybe some marketing campaign, if there's some clients out there that don't like our marketing campaign or feel like it's too similar to some of our competition's marketing campaign, how do we deal with all these customer complaints? All right, so let me go ahead and finish this here just quickly. Business resumption and contingency plan. So this gets back to maybe that embedded option, foreign-based service providers. Of course, everybody in every country is not aware of all the laws, but when we hire a third-party outsource that is from another country, we need to make sure that they're aware of all of our laws and that we're equally aware of their laws. And then, of course, we can do a double outsourcing. Are we going to allow our outsourced activities to be subcontracted or outsourced themselves? I'm guessing that lots of you who have built houses know the pain of subcontracting when your house builder, does the walls and does the roof, and then they subcontract maybe the electricity or the plumbing or whatever it is. And so then you get who's to blame, right? So we need to make sure we know who to blame and what those consequences are once we figure out who is to blame. And then as part, whoops, I went a little bit too far. As part of, let's swing back up to that first one there, as part of this business resumption and contingency plan, how as a financial institution are we going to move forward? And does that involve, let me go back here, does it result in termination? And so that takes us through this brief letter. So this was a relatively short video. I try to keep these things as short as possible, but as you know, I do a lot of talking. So only 3 of these here. I would think all 3 of them are important.